maybe I'm making a mountain out of a molehill. It certainly wouldn't be the first time that's happened, because today what I wanted to do was talk about two teams included on the NHL's very first Super 16 rankings for the 2024-2025 season. The list was published on September 20th, 2 days ago, and because there hasn't really been much movement in the NHL from 2 days ago to now, I feel comfortable going out there and using this list as the quote-unquote up-to-date list. Essentially, the NHL's Super 16 is just their power rankings for teams in the league heading into the start of the year. And of course, power rankings, it's like, hey, which team is the best right now? Which team is projected to being the best right now? A lot of people put emphasis on these lists, and a lot of people like to keep track of them weekly just to see where their favorite teams are stacked up against other teams around the league, and to just kind of get a general grasp as to who's trending upwards, who's trending downwards, who's hot, and who's not. To start things off, though, I wanted to have a conversation about Canadian teams in the National Hockey League, because it's been a pretty big question the entire, I want to say, millennium, right? Who's going to be the Canadian team that brings Lord Stanley's Grail north of the border once again? For the first time in 30 years. There have been multiple teams that have attempted it. Calgary in 2004, Ottawa had one as well against Anaheim, Vancouver, Montreal, Edmonton most recently. So a lot of teams have made it to the finals. It's just kind of coincidental, really, that out of the X amount of Canadian teams to have made the finals in the 2000s and beyond, every single one of them ended up losing, with a bunch of them losing in Game 7, too. How great is that, right? So, with this in mind, let's go over to some of the Canadian teams, and in particular, I wanted to talk about two of them that are ranked in certain spots. The highest Canadian team is the Edmonton Oilers. They're second overall in the power rankings, which makes sense because they just finished as the Stanley Cup runner-ups. That really kind of gives you a pass into the top of the list for next season. Obviously, number one is the Florida Panthers. But if you scroll over into the bottom of the top 10, from 6 to 10, it goes as follows. 6, you have the Colorado Avalanche. 7, you have the Nashville Predators. 8, you have the Vancouver Canucks. 9, you have the Toronto Maple Leafs. And 10, you have the Carolina Hurricanes. I wanted to talk about 8 and 9, Vancouver and Toronto. But before we dive into that, I wanted to say quickly for my Canucks fans out there, yeah, Nashville is ranked ahead of Vancouver at 7. It's not terribly unfathomable to understand why they put them there. They just added Stamkos, they just added Jonathan Marchessault, so that team's going to be good. So even though they had themselves a brief stint in the 2024 Stanley Cup Playoffs wherein they were eliminated by Vancouver, their additions were pretty big, so I do think it warrants having them move up as high as they did in the power rankings. However, I wanted to dive into 8 and 9, Vancouver and Toronto, and ask the question here, is Vancouver really a better team, quote-unquote, than the Toronto Maple Leafs? Well, let's dive into that here and break everything down. Because, to start things off, I'd say that both Toronto and Vancouver have significantly high expectations. And I say significantly with 100% of my heart here, because realistically, if you told Canucks fans and Leafs fans, hey, your team is making the second round in the 2025 Stanley Cup Playoffs, I think both teams' fan bases would respond in a way that's sort of like, yeah, okay, that's expected. Then what did they do? It's not an, oh crap, they made the second round, amazing, let's go. Hell yeah, big dub, big progress being made there. For Toronto, you could say maybe it's progress, but still, with both of these teams, there is an element of projected success that both of them will have in the regular season and potentially even in the first round. With Vancouver, in particular, you saw Patrik Allvin at the end of season press conference saying that it's kind of disappointing to be talking to the media and answering these questions about their elimination after holding a 3-2 series lead in the Oilers series and eventually losing. Patrik Allvin was like, yeah, it's disappointing to be here today. They should have gone further. They could have gone further. For Toronto, while there weren't any direct comments from Sheldon Keefe saying similar things, there still was an idea saying, really? They lost in the first round again? This time around, I mean, they had a realistic chance at making it to round 2 like they did last year, but it all boiled down to a Game 7 overtime winner, thanks Ilya Samsonov. Ultimately, though, both of these teams, Vancouver and Toronto, have expectations, and the reason they have expectations is because they are good. Vancouver, I'd say, doesn't have the top-tier forward talent like Toronto does. I'd honestly take Nylander, Marner, and Matthews over Pettersson, Miller, and Besser. It's very close, but I would say that Matthews, Marner, and Nylander are a better trio of top-tier forwards. However, Vancouver has depth at forward that Toronto does not have. That third line, Blueger, Joshua Garland, is better than most NHL teams' second lines, in my opinion. And when you consider the additions that the Canucks have made to bolster up some of their top guys, you gotta remember, Elias Pettersson had a bad, down year compared to his standards last season. Now with Jake DeBrusk on his wing, he probably will find a way to bounce back and start scoring the lights out again. Matthews, Marner, and Nylander are kind of right there with John Tavares as being forced to carry the load because the rest of the Toronto forward core just doesn't really have the same stuff. They spent all their money on their top guys. They can only afford to get other players signed to ELCs and below throughout the rest of their forward core. Going over onto defense, I would say that both teams have a similar mindset with the additions of Chris Tanev and Hakanpää and I guess now you could say OEL. You could understand what the Toronto Maple Leafs are building on their D-core. They want guys who can be defensively minded, who can block shots. OEL isn't really the kind of guy to be penciled into that role, but he did kind of form into that this previous season with the Florida Panthers. Tanev and Hakanpää, though, absolute monsters at blocking shots. Vancouver, you could say, similar thing. They got some big dudes, they've got some physical dudes. Myers, Soucy, Desharnais, Forbort, but the X factor that Vancouver has on defense, they've got two absolute studs on their offensive defenseman side. Hughes and Hronek are both fantastic. Meanwhile, in Toronto, you've got Morgan Rielly, and I'd say that's right about it. The rest of the D-core I don't think has the capability of matching what a Quinn Hughes can do offensively, just for example. Then you have yourselves the goaltending. This is where Vancouver, I'd say, when everybody's healthy, Vancouver is one of the best goaltending tandems in the NHL. Even if it's Demko and Silayev, you want to talk about Silayev, okay, he's a guy who's just still a rookie. He had a stint in the playoffs last year. Let's even ignore Artur Silayev. Let's say it's Demko and Lankinen. That pairing is one of the best pairings in the NHL, in my opinion, when you consider how good Demko was. He was a Vezina finalist, and Kevin Lankinen was a 905 plus goaltender for 2 straight years with the Nashville Predators. Add in Artur Silayev to the mix, and you have yourselves a really good winning formula. In Toronto, Joseph Woll is that guy. He is that good, but like Silayev, he is unproven. The Maple Leafs did acquire Anthony Stolarz, who I do think is like really, really underratedly good. You could even say he was better than Bobrovsky, but Bobrovsky got the starts and he got the wins because, you know, he's making a whole bunch of money. He kind of needed to do that. But Anthony Stolarz was legitimately a contender for being better than Bob, a Stanley Cup winning caliber goaltender from last year in the entire regular season. So big boost up to Toronto's goaltending, a lot better than Ilya Samsonov, but I would personally still give the edge to Vancouver if you assume Thatcher Demko is healthy and he comes back being able to play at 100%. So with all this in mind, I think that if you tried to even it out, I'd say Toronto has the edge in guaranteed goaltending, just because Thatcher Demko is not certain to being available at the start of the year, and Toronto also has the edge in top-tier forwards. But in other areas, I'd say that Vancouver's D-core is better. I think their tandem, when everybody is healthy, is better, and I do think their forward depth is better, so it's a pretty tight race. Also, you have Vancouver with the second-round pedigree from last season. Toronto lost out on that because they didn't win against the Boston Bruins in round 1 this previous year. So ultimately, I do understand and agree with this assessment of having Vancouver 1 spot ahead of Toronto in the 2024 opening Super 16 power rankings published by the NHL. If you're a fan of the Canucks or a fan of the Toronto Maple Leafs, let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. How do you feel about this ranking, and how do you feel about your teams being placed where they are? Is Vancouver really better than Toronto at this point? Are the Maple Leafs being undervalued here? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I hope you enjoyed this video. And bye.